So today we are going to be discussing the chapter on the origin of species. Ernst Mayr traveled and explored Dutch New Guinea in the quest of exploring animals and plants such as birds, species, and orchids. He may not have had the experience, but he did have the resources to lead him to his journey of being able to travel and study what he wished. He published several books, and among many of them was The Animal Species and Evolution, where he found a dispute between what natives/locals and scientists thought to be a species of bird, as the locals found 136 and scientists found 137. This pointed out that the discontinuities within nature are the reality. When you look at organisms like animals, you are able to see differences since the groups can be so diverse even if they are closely related. This is seen with organisms that reproduce sexually, as you can get a variation, which is discontinuity, even though evolution is thought of as continuous. This is where speciation/the origin of species comes in. In Darwin's book, he didn't seem to think the natural selection would favor discontinuity or see it as an issue. Darwin did explain how one species changes over time, but he didn't clarify why they diverge into separate species. Through this, we are aware that speciation did occur because there is biodiversity and not just one long chain of the past descendants. The way we represent species is based off of the morphological species concept, where they all look alike versus the organisms. So an example here would be the tiger. The category tiger would be defined as a group including all Asian cats whose adults are more than 5 feet long and have vertical black stripes on an orange body with white patches around the eyes and mouth. Biologists still identify organisms differently because some look fairly similar but are classified as different species. An example is a Drosophila. The females are indistinguishable and the males are, but on a minuscule scale. The reason behind the cryptic forms of species looking alike but not always being recognized as the same species is due to them being reproductively isolated. They may share the same location but don't mate, so they consist of different gene pools. A good example would be the humans with colored eyes, because they belong to the same gene pool since they are able to mate with each other and produce offspring that are a combination of both of the parents' genes. Then we have the concept which was developed after this realization, known as the biological species concept, that states a group of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. That means that there are differences among appearances or behaviors or any physiological trait among different species that doesn't allow them to interbreed. Mating among closely related species can be prevented by the time of year that they reproduce, or it can be a physical characteristic or trait that one species has and the other species doesn't find them sexually attractive. Another possibility can be the isolation of habitats, or some species are restricted to different species or plants specifically. If mating does occur, the barriers may still exist, as the fetus may die before birth or a hybrid may be produced. If the hybrid is produced, it is possible that they will be sterile. A good example of this is the mule, which is a cross between the female horse and a male donkey. BCS helps to explain how reproductive barriers evolve, and that also explains the origin of species along with it. Naturalists made an important observation known as sister species, meaning they are each other's closest relatives. Somehow they were separated by geographical barriers. Divergent selection. That's a selection that drives different populations in different evolutionary directions. An example would be something that arose from the same species or plant, but with a barrier that came in between them, so the species diverged differently. And if somehow that barrier were to be taken away and they were to come back together, they would no longer be the same species, but still come from the same ancestor and be closely related. Overall, species do not arise to fill empty niches, but rather, speciation tells us that species are evolutionary accidents. They don't arise because there is a need for diversity, but arise from barriers when populations are isolated and then evolve in different directions. Darwin also brought up the divergence among languages, where languages drifted, but some words are still similar and can be traced to having a common ancestor. Along the divergence, there is a possibility of new languages as a byproduct, as there is a transition or imitation of languages. Imitation among languages is known as cross-fertilized, as some phrases are adopted from other languages. Then we have the theory of geographic speciation. That is the idea of geographic isolation being the first step in the origin of species. This is because if they stay within the same location, they are prone to the possibility of interbreeding and becoming a general species. Overall, evolution is not a divergence and it's not intentional.
If speciation depends on geographic isolation, then there must be many opportunities for it to occur. Geographic isolation is very common. Earth's features are always rapidly changing. Mountain ranges rise, glaciers spread, deserts form, continents drift, and drought divides forests. Every time this happens, this is a new opportunity for new species to arise. For example, the Isthmus of Panama, which arose beneath the ocean, separated populations of marine wildlife, which gave rise to new species. Reproductive barriers often induce speciation. Testing of fruit flies, because of their short generational lifespan, gives proof that, if isolated, can adapt to new environments. That could mean consumption of different types of foods based on that new environment. DNA testing can reveal just how long ago a species evolved by testing the difference between two specific species and how different the DNA is from one another. Sister species will often occupy lands that were at one point the same region, then became separated. An example of speciation occurring today is the Satyrium halaki, which lives in South Africa. In the northern and eastern parts of the country, it is pollinated by hawk moths and long-tongued flies. To attract these pollinators, the orchid has evolved long nectar tubes in its flowers. Pollinators can occur only when the long-tongued moths and flies get close enough to the flower to stick their tongue into the tubes. But in the coastal regions, the only pollinators are short-tongued bees, and here the orchid has evolved much shorter nectar tubes. Some biologists believe that there can be speciation within the same area without the need for a geographic barrier. This concept is called sympatric speciation. Darwin believed that this was entirely possible, especially with plants. It is very possible, but very uncommon in nature. It is very difficult for nature to produce such a thing because of interbreeding, holding gene pools together. When species are in the same area and can mate, they will mate, and eventually genes will mix and not create a new species. Two related species may live in the same area, but that doesn't always mean there was speciation. It could mean that their habitats eventually overlapped through time. There is yet another type of speciation called polyploid species. New species can arise from abnormally high amounts of chromosomes when a sperm and an egg unite. There are two different types of this. One is allopolyploid species. That is when a hybrid species doubles its chromosomes, creating a new species that cannot interbreed with either parent. And since it cannot interbreed with the parent, it has to branch off into its own. The second type is autopolyploid species, which double their chromosomes from a single species. not as rare as one might think, considering how many eggs are released by plants. Plants are very commonly doing this. This is a very good way to look at speciation because it only takes about 2 generations for a new polyploid species to develop. Polyploid is very rare in animals, especially mammals. But there is one example of a polyploid species, which is the Vizcacha rat from Argentina, who has developed 112 chromosomes. Polyploid speciation is completely separate from other types of speciation because it affects the chromosomal count and not the genes. Polyploid speciation can also go unnoticed, such that scientists have created the same hybrid species when testing it in a lab. Then they realized that nature had already created this species long ago. Speciation is very evident in our world. The facts are everywhere. From new species beginning to form by hybridization to new ones arising from the barriers that enable them to evolve. All this put together, the fact is that speciation occurs everywhere on the planet and has been occurring for millions of years, which is the evidence for the hundreds of millions of species that we have today.